Why are global investors so anxious about China's third plenum? And more, what makes Washington nervous about this latest political gathering? The decisions made in Beijing this week will ripple through global markets. This closed-door meeting could be the turning point for investors worldwide. What major economic reforms did China unveil at the third plenum? Today we go deep into China's third plenum, a historic meeting behind closed doors where China's leaders are setting the stage for the next decade. With China's economy growing by 4.7% last quarter, what comes next could be even more significant. Over 60% of China's GDP is tied to the private sector. So what will the third plenum decide about its future? How will China's focus on technological independence affect global industries? Stay with us to find out why this event has global investors and Washington on edge.
What would we have to deter China? In my opinion, we have economic strength. China will probably have more military, bigger navies, more weapons, more missiles. They'll have nuclear. They've got space. They have a space station. They've got all of that. But what if they had an internal economic crisis because none of the major economies of the world were investing there, doing business there, creating jobs there? It would be the collapse of their economy that would be our best leverage in China. So how do we have that unity? We have that unity by having the democracies and the strong economies allied together in a security relationship.
The third plenum of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China is a major political meeting that took place from July 15th to 18th, 2024. Annual plenums typically occur in autumn, but this one, expected for October 2023, was postponed to this week. While many observers attribute the delay of the plenum to China's economic struggles, some speculate that recent removals of high-ranking officials may have also played a role. However, President Xi Jinping did not explicitly address this speculation during the meetings, leaving them as unverified rumors. These plenary sessions historically introduced significant reforms, like Deng Xiaoping's 1978 policy. This plenum focuses on deepening economic reforms, tech independence, and rebalancing the economy, aiming to create a high-standard socialist market economy, which is essential for China's modernization. Analysts expected the meeting to address new industrialization, boost intelligent manufacturing, tackle weak demand and property market issues, deepen supply-side reforms, enhance high-quality development, create growth drivers, support the private sector, attract foreign investment, and introduce fiscal policies. Well, what impact might China's fiscal reforms have on local and global markets? This plenum is different from the others because it's focused on moving China from fast growth to sustainable innovation. This is an urgent issue because of the current economic challenges and geopolitical tensions. The third plenum of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China was done behind closed doors, which led to a lot of guesswork about what it was about. The West, especially the US, is on edge because the plenum was expected to tackle the issue of technological independence, which is crucial for sectors like electric vehicles and semiconductors at a time when geopolitical tensions are on the rise. US executives from big companies like Goldman Sachs, Starbucks, and Nike were planning to visit Beijing to get more info on these talks. This increased nervousness comes from the possibility of new policies that would tighten economic controls and centralize resource allocation under Xi Jinping's leadership. The West is worried that China's strategic shifts could have a big impact on global markets and trade, especially as China continues to improve its ability to withstand pressure from the US and the European Union. Why is the US particularly concerned about China's latest economic strategies? The third plenary session ended with a full report outlining all the decisions and directions set by the committee. The session, run by the Political Bureau and led by General Secretary Xi Jinping, was a big moment in China's strategic planning. The Central Committee gave the green light to the resolution on further deepening reform to advance Chinese modernization. The resolution reaffirmed the party's continued commitment to Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the theory of three represents, and the scientific outlook on development. It also placed a strong emphasis on implementing Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. The main things that came out of the meeting were a reaffirmation of the guiding principles from the 20th National Party Congress and a commitment to pursuing high-quality development. The committee highlighted the need to strike a balance between development and security, promote socialist democracy, advance the rule of law, and improve public communication and cultural work. The committee also emphasized the need to protect national security, maintain social stability, and advance national defense and the armed forces. The resolution lays out a plan for a high-level socialist market economy by 2035. The goal is to modernize China's governance systems and improve market efficiency. China plans to modernize the financial system and improve market regulation to create a more resilient and dynamic economy. The goal is to have a competitive market by making sure that state-owned and private enterprises are treated equally. So, the main goals are to promote fair competition, remove barriers, and improve resource allocation to increase global competitiveness and reduce external pressures from the United States and the European Union. The plan is to focus on sound macroeconomic regulation, including tax and fiscal reforms, transparent budget management to support regional development and address local government debts. On top of that, policymakers are looking on integrating the real economy with the digital economy, update infrastructure, and make sure industrial and supply chains are secure. The session highlighted the importance of education, science, and technology in driving modernization. The plan is to invigorate China through science and education, develop a quality workforce, and promote innovation-driven development. This includes making big changes to education, scientific and technological institutions, and talent development. It was agreed that integrated urban-rural development is key to Chinese modernization. The Plenum laid out plans to bring the city and countryside closer together, improve the basic rural operating system, and boost agriculture and rural areas through targeted support systems. So, while NATO discusses reclaiming Chinese-owned infrastructure in Europe, China advances its plan to open its economy. This involves leveraging its large market for international cooperation, continuing reforms, and enhancing trade structures. Opening up is key to Chinese modernization, aiming to improve both inward and outward investment management. The Plenum also looked at ways to develop a more inclusive form of democracy and to strengthen the rule of law, which are seen as key to China's modernization. This means making democratic institutions stronger, improving how we make decisions together, and making the rule of law work better to make sure everyone gets a fair deal. In the cultural sphere, the resolution highlighted the need to boost cultural confidence, develop advanced socialist culture, and promote traditional Chinese culture. This idea is to get people creative with culture and make it easier for China to share its story with the world. The plan aims to enhance public services, social security, healthcare, and population support, prioritizing well-being and practical issues. Additionally, China focuses on ecological conservation, pursuing green development and achieving harmony between humanity and nature through an ecological civilization and reduced carbon emissions. National security is still a big part of China's development strategy, and the country is planning some improvements to its national security institutions and mechanisms. This includes making public security governance, social stability, and national security in foreign-related affairs stronger. How does national security fit into China's latest economic plans? The meeting also talked about modernizing the national defense and the armed forces. They said that reforms are needed to achieve the centenary goal of the People's Liberation Army by 2027 and to make sure the military is loyal to the party. It appears that the Plenum results show a shift toward self-reliance and centralized control, that economic strategies are aligned with national security. Efforts are also being made to reduce dependence on foreign technologies due to trade tensions. China's focus on national security reforms highlights its efforts to protect its interests. This will have an impact on international relations, and global investors need to keep an eye on it. What do you think? What impact might China's third plenum decisions have on the global stage? We are excited to delve into this topic at Think BRICS. Join us for a live stream on Sunday with China's super expert, Professor Warwick from Queensland University of Technology. Then, on Tuesday, South African analyst Jana de Kluvia from the Institute for Security Studies will provide an African perspective. Share your thoughts and questions as we explore China's impact on global dynamics. Don't miss these engaging and informative sessions. What do you think these changes mean for the future of international trade and investment? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your network, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights on BRICS trends. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.
Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. Hi Anastasia. Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. All right. We've been searching diligently for an expert in appropriate and applicable fields so that we could explore one of the founding BRICS countries, China. We think that our special guest tonight will be able to help us give you an excellent historical and current view of China and its impact within and outside of the BRICS Alliance. So in this episode, we'll cover the topics of China's third plenum, obviously, which was postponed for almost a year, but just concluded a few days ago. Digital payments and supply chain digitalization in the context of transformations in the global economic system. The mBridge wholesale instant payment platform and CBDCs. The idea of an alternative internet and internet censorship. The BRICS bridge payment system. And of course, de-dollarization. Our special guest tonight is Adjunct Professor Warwick Powell. Warwick has a very long bio, so I will give only some of his current background, and you can see links to more below. Warwick is Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology in Australia, Chairman of the Smart Trade Networks in Hong Kong, China, Senior Fellow of the Tahi Institute in Beijing, China, author of the 2023 book, China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains Dynamics of a Zero Trust World. Welcome, Warwick.
How are you? Good to be here.
Welcome.
Oh, good, thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for your time.
Sure. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. So,
Okay.
let's get started.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Professor, the title of this show is Don't miss out how China's new economic strategies impact you. This is the title we have today. So, what we, like ordinary, normal people, should expect? What should we be ready for? What kind of a great nation China will be? An expropriator, like the US, the UK, or a great enabler?
Yeah, well, they're big questions, aren't they? And I would suggest that by and large, Chinese modernization has been focused on working out exactly how China will conduct itself on the global stage. You've got to remember, though, that first and foremost, China's principal focus, particularly in terms of government, is on its domestic situation, and that means to do what it needs to do to improve the livelihoods of 1.4 billion people. And that has been its predominant focus over the last 40 to 50 years, if not a bit longer. The recently concluded third plenum, in most respects, points to a consolidation of the broad direction that has been in place since the early 2010s, and really says to the world that China is going to continue its program of economic opening up. And that means not just on the trade front, but importantly also in terms of investment and the exchange of knowledge and ideas and the facilitation of the movement of people. These dimensions of Chinese modernization, the fact that China is committed to being increasingly open to the world, will, I think, position China to behave a lot more like a great enabler rather than a great expropriator. And I say that because one of the key things that has begun to emerge over the last few years already is that China has itself become an exporter of capital. And in becoming an exporter of capital, it is bringing to other parts of the world the experience, the know-how, the technical capabilities, and the resources necessary to enable other parts of the world to move up the value-adding curve. So I think in a very broad sense, that's how I think the Chinese economy and the Chinese leadership is seeking to orient their policy focus over the next decade or more.
Okay, no, that's great. And in the video that we ran before we sort of officially started the live stream, we were really trying to help people understand about what is the plenum, the third plenum in this case. Hopefully we can do that. And so my first sort of question is, what is the plenum, and what is the significance of the third plenum of the 20th Central Committee, and what major economic reforms were unveiled during this meeting?
The plenary sessions are part and parcel of Chinese governance. So Chinese governance is driven through it's actually a multi-party system under the leadership of the Communist Party. And in China, there's, from memory, 8 different political parties, but the Communist Party of China is the leading party. The plenary session of the Central Committee brings together the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and there are over 200 members of the Central Committee. And it is the focal point of decision-making. Now, I say decision-making because it's really where the work that has been done over the previous 12 months, and in some instances, previous few years, around policy challenges, identification of problems, diagnosing the nature of problems, exploring possible remedial options, and ultimately reaching the point where a consensus has been reached between the various stakeholders who are impacted by anticipated decisions. It then comes to the plenum, whereby the decisions are ultimately locked into stone. So the plenary session is really the moment where the groundwork that has been done over the previous time period, together with the debates and the arguments and the considerations, reflections, and dialogue, ultimately lead to a concerted or a consensus policy stance. So that's essentially what the plenary session does. And so, many people in the West would be unfamiliar with that style of decision making, but it's actually a very dialectical decision-making process where dialogue sits at the very heart of how the decisions are made by the leadership and by the legal institutions, in this case, the Central Committee. The dialectical process really means that the relationships between the different stakeholders is an interactive one, where issues that are identified on the ground are discussed and raised at different levels of government and political consideration. They're then, I guess, reflected through the lenses of other stakeholders and other priorities, where there may be conflicting priorities or at least misalignments, and ultimately through a process of dialogue where conversations and discussions and at times debates about how to manage the trade-offs and achieve the right balance, decisions are ultimately met. Now, that style of decision-making runs very contrary to the sort of Westminster style of decision-making, where public displays of opposition are what draws people's attention, which is, of course, things like question time in a parliament. Whereas this process within the Chinese environment is very much about institutionalizing dialogue, whereby differences can be worked through in a collegiate environment, ultimately with a view to arriving at a consensus that all stakeholders can accept as a reasonable balance against a set of mutually agreed objectives.
That's very interesting. That to actually, I really appreciate that, Warwick, particularly just explaining the difference of our political systems. Because I really love that. I used to actually watch in Australia. I think it was called APAC. It used to be on a few years ago. They cut it where it actually showed our parliamentarians, our representatives talking, and it showed the whole process throughout the whole working day. And it was very interesting. You actually see the people, say what they say. But I think that's very interesting. I've watched UK Parliament and the way they sort of operate, which is a little bit different to other parliaments. They're actually very courteous in the UK with each other when they talk, which is very strange. I don't know if you've ever had the privilege of watching that, but if you should watch it because it's really weird. But anyway, go ahead, Anastasia, with the next topic. We've got limited time.
Yeah. In the end, after this session was over, there was a document released with the main topics that was dedicated to, and one topic that took my attention mostly dedicated to digitalization. And the topic was also about that China want to implement digitalization approach towards digitalization into real economy.
Yeah.
And so how is China's focus on digital payments, because this is the digitalization we're talking about, and supply chain digitalization, reshaping its role in the global economic system?
Yeah, great question. Look, China has been a leader in digitalization of economic processes now for over a decade. Most people will know of the digitalization that has already taken place through payment systems such as Alipay and WeChat Pay, where the ubiquitous use of QR code payment protocols underpins how most people do their business in China these days. That's not to say that physical cash isn't used. It can be and remains something that is used by some people in certain circumstances. But by and large, for the sake of convenience, most Chinese people these days conduct their day-to-day business with electronic payments. So e-commerce and digital payments has been part and parcel of the Chinese experience now for over a decade. The other thing that's happened in the last decade has been the boom in e-commerce, and that has been given a real kick along during the COVID pandemic period, when people were forced to work or stay away from offices, to stay in homes, to stay in their apartments, and that really spurred on the home deliveries or the general deliveries business, where significant improvements had to be made to how the last mile in supply chains work, so as to handle large volumes of demand for the delivery of products, and to ensure that products and would be delivered very, very quickly to the people who ordered them. So a fairly comprehensive e-commerce environment has emerged over the course of the last decade in China. Where we're now heading to is really, in many ways, the next phase of digitalization. And digitalization is really targeted at two core areas. Firstly, there's digitalization of the production systems themselves. There's a recognition that if greater productivity is to be achieved in the production of things, then there is going to be a need for automation, and automation is something that needs a significant amount of data inputs. So the digitalization of production systems is part and parcel of an ongoing process of automation. We're also seeing the digitalization of other parts of the supply chain, particularly in areas such as ports, where large smart port projects have been implemented that have reduced the amount of time it takes for a standard container ship to be unloaded. In the past, a container ship would take around 8 hours to unload at the port of Tianjin, for example. Now it takes a little bit over 40 minutes, and that's driven by IoT devices and data-driven automations of cranes and other vehicles on site. So data, again, as well as computational capabilities, is a precondition for the achievement of efficiencies and productivity. The last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, if you will, is in the ongoing integration of digital payments with data about what happens in supply chains themselves. So as the supply chain systems, which is in effect enterprises and organizations together with their various activities, whether they're a factory or a farm or a transport system or a warehouse, a cold storage, or what have you, as more and more data is being captured about those activities and about the goods and services that are being handled during those processes, the more effective it is to be able to integrate information about what happens in supply chains with payment processes. And I guess what that really leads to finally is the ongoing development of the digital RMB, which is China's central bank digital currency. Now, that project is part and parcel of a holistic approach to economic digitalization aimed at, as I mentioned, delivering efficiencies in both production as well as in logistics. Now, the last piece, and this is where the digital RMB, together with digitalization of supply chains, is likely to play an important role, is in efficiencies in capital utilization. So the amount of money capital that a supply chain requires to function is affected by how quickly the payments actually take place, and the speed at which payments take place is a function of how quickly we can satisfy the payer that the conditions of the deal have been met. So if it's possible to instruct the payer, and the payer could be an algorithm, right, or an institution or a human being, but the quicker you can instruct the payer that the goods have been delivered and that the conditions of the agreement have been met, the quicker and sooner it is possible for the payments to be made. And the faster you can make that system work, the less money capital sits idle within that process. Now, we've done some studies of our own through some of the supply chains we've been involved with, which in very crude terms have delivered already productivity gains in terms of capital utilization of about 18%. So we've reduced the total time involved in completing a full transaction by 18%. Now, over the course of 12 months, what that really means is that a given dollar of money capital that's used as working capital or supply chain payments capital can actually be used one more time. So instead of it being used, in our case, it was 5 times, we could get 5 transactions, full circuits through. The minute we started digitalizing it using blockchain technologies, improved data flows between the actors, we were able to actually use that same unit of working capital one more time during 12 months. So that's a very significant productivity improvement in the process flow itself.
It is.
We've got a question here.
Yeah.
So we've got a question from Laurie. I'm interested in how many containers are unloaded in 40 minutes. I'm not sure about.
And what I'd suggest Laurie do is type into his search engine Huawei Smartport Tianjin, and there's some fantastic videos of the processes happening, and there's plenty of information available now in terms of short documentaries and videos on how that actually takes place, and it is really a sight to behold when you begin to appreciate how the streamlining and automation of large industrial processes are able to gain these sorts of efficiencies. I'll give you another amazing bit of data, if you will, on production efficiencies. Many of your viewers will no doubt be aware of the BYD electric vehicles, and some of the factories now are so automated that they are producing a new automotive vehicle off the lines every 70 odd seconds. That's an incredible production outcome.
Whoa.
Excuse me?
Every 73 seconds.
73 seconds.
A new completed motor vehicle is coming off the production lines. And again, I just suggest to your viewers that if they're interested, they'll be able to search on their search engine of choice for videos on BYD or other EV manufacturing automations. They're quite a significant production and engineering feat.
It certainly is. We've got quite a lot of questions from the audience, and usually, Warwick, we try to actually input them, but the third plenum, there's so much has come out of it. It's so important. So, and we try to only go for an hour. So we will try to have some questions put up, but if we can't, but we'll have Warwick back on if he's willing to, and we'll dive deeper and we'll save these questions. So we do apologize. We just have limited time.
Let's do our best. Let's do our best.
Yeah, exactly right. So, and the questions that we've already formulated here, we've taken the audience feedback too, and we know that they're interested in these. So, so the next question, about mBridge, the wholesale instant payment platform. Can you just explain, from your point of view as a professional, because we've heard others, but can you explain the mBridge wholesale instant payment platform and its impact on international final transactions?
So mBridge is a bank-to-bank payments settlement platform. It has been developed over the last 3 years by a consortium of central banks, namely the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of Thailand, the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and the Bank of International Settlements. And in the last month or so, the Central Bank of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has also joined as a full participant. In addition to these participants, there are over 20 observers, most of whom are also central banks from around the world. The project was designed to enable the settlement of cross-border payments at a bank-to-bank level in a way that was fast and cheap, and which was, for all intents and purposes, instantaneous. It does that by operating on a distributed ledger, which is a blockchain, and a consensus mechanism that has each of the central banks as block settlers, or have the rights to write new blocks. And there's actually underneath those central banks is a network of commercial banks that actually also maintain a copy of the ledger. What people, and I guess your viewers, should probably keep in mind is that money these days is actually not much more than notations in ledgers. And what exists in one ledger as an asset, by definition, exists somewhere else as a liability. And that's a function of double entry bookkeeping. So in economic terms, the entire economic system is actually, globally and nationally, is actually an interlocked network of balance sheets, of income and expenditure, and assets and liabilities. When we get to cross-border trade, they are typically settled actually at a bank-to-bank level. So an exporter in one country has a relationship with their bank in that country, and an importer in another country has a relationship with their bank. And the settlements process actually takes place via an interaction between the banks themselves as adjustments are made to their respective ledgers. So as one bank deducts from their ledger, the other bank adds on their side of the fence. When that happens traditionally, it's a very linear process. So as it happens on one side, a message is sent to the next side then validates whether that message is appropriate. Then eventually they will update the ledger of their client. Now that process can take anywhere up to 3 days. And that has been a long-standing complaint about the SWIFT network, that not only is the settlement of payments slow, it's actually also an expensive process. So the fees that are charged are quite high. But not only is it the fees that are high, as I described earlier, if you can speed the settlement of transactions, you're actually reducing the amount of working capital that's necessary for the system to work. And if you can reduce the amount of working capital that you need, whereby most of that capital actually happens to be supply chain debt finance, you're actually reducing the amount of cost of supply chain debt that you need to smooth out the transactions process. So when you think about this as a total system, which is what economies are, you're really enabling the aggregate reduction of the amount of money capital needed for the system to work, therefore reducing the amount of interest payments that enterprises are going to need, and reducing the fees and charges that enterprises will be forced to incur. So mBridge settles these transactions because each of the central banks is actually operating on the same ledger infrastructure and making adjustments to the respective ledgers that they all actually curate together and are responsible for the integrity of these ledgers together at the same time. So in formal terms, we basically talk about synchrony, right, which is where the timing of the updates are happening at the same time, and symmetry, whereby all parties actually know the same information. So that's mBridge. mBridge in the last 2 years has done a lot of trials. It has actually upgraded its consensus mechanism last year to enable faster settlements and finality. And it has recently rolled out its first minimum viable product, which is to support cross-border settlements. And that cross-border settlements minimum viable product, still in test phase, has been used by WePay on the mainland China side to settle transactions with counterparties on the Hong Kong side. What's interesting about this, and this is the last point that I'll mention at this stage, is that it supports the settlement of transactions in national currencies. So there is no third-party currency that mediates the transaction. So the payer pays in their national currency, and the receiver receives adjustments in their ledger in their national currency.
Right. That's very good, because that's certainly
Yeah,
something that
it
the
is.
BRICS, yeah, had
Yeah,
wanted
this is
to.
the trend among BRICS nations to use their national currencies. But the one thing we can't miss that that the volume of Chinese currency, the yuan, in international trade and cross-border payments is raising from month to month.
Yeah.
We see that between China and Russia, they use yuan. Between China and the Gulf countries. So the question is in the air. Is the de-dollarization narrative real?
In some parts it is, of course. And I think it's probably important, again, for your viewers to understand how the overall system works globally. Often people, when they hear the word de-dollarization, they immediately think that the dollar disappears. But, but what's important to bear in mind, as I mentioned earlier, is that these days money is actually notations in ledgers. So as those notations are made in ledgers as assets on certain ledgers, they don't actually disappear. They stay inside the system. So even as, for example, the Chinese central bank has been selling down its holdings of US dollar treasuries and buying gold, the dollars that it's exchanged for these things actually still exists in the system. So the first thing to bear in mind is that the dollars themselves don't disappear. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, where do they go? And what are the consequences of these new systems of flow? That's something to bear in mind. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The second thing to bear in mind is that
Well,
at heart, the issue of cross-border transactions is actually driven not by the flow of money first, but by the need to flow goods and services. Money by itself doesn't move. The exchange of funds or the payments is actually only as a consequence of a desire to trade in real goods and services. And as China over the last 40 years, and in particular the last 24 years, has become the world's largest trading partner of some 140 countries or thereabouts, the need to use an intermediating currency such as the US dollar begins to diminish, because there is sufficient amount of supply and demand of real goods and services within these 140 countries for something like the RMB to become quite useful for everybody. That's the first thing. The second thing too, and people often ask me, how quickly do I think this can happen? And I say, well, the last 2 years has actually shown how quickly it can happen when necessity knocks on your door. And I mean by that the situation of China-Russia trade. From the situation in early 2022 to now, we've seen a dramatic increase and transformation in the settlement currencies that's used to make those exchanges possible. So much so that somewhere in the region of 93% of trade transactions between Russian enterprises and Chinese enterprises is now denominated in either the RMB or the ruble. So it's remarkable how quickly it can happen if need be. The point, though, that I want to just to touch on, and we can perhaps explore this in a little bit more detail, is if the US dollars don't disappear, but they remain inside the system. So imagine the global financial system as a balloon, and I don't mean by that analogy something that pops, right? But just so maybe it's not the best analogy, but imagine it as a balloon that's constantly being added to by different people pumping things into it. And as that balloon expands, And as you know, if you squeeze a balloon, something else pops up somewhere else, right? So, but the air in that balloon stays inside the balloon, and currencies is the same, because the currencies themselves actually remain on the balance sheets and ledgers of companies and central banks. So the issue is as countries uh, relinquish US dollars in their accounts in exchange for other things, whether it's gold or copper or other commodities, or other currencies, somebody somewhere in the system is actually accumulating more US dollars. And that person or that group of persons is likely to be a group of persons who believe that the US dollar will continue to remain useful and valuable to them. Now, the actors for whom US dollars will be most useful, of course, are American companies and American citizens, because that is the national currency. And if you're in the business of living in the United States and doing business in the United States, then US dollars is actually pretty useful. Also, countries and companies that continue to do a lot of business with the United States will have good reasons to hold on to some volume of US dollars. But the amount of US dollars that they need for those purposes is, of course, a lot smaller than the total volume of global trade that used to be supported by US dollars, which means that at some point, this, in its essence, this extra underutilized USD is going to end up back in the United States. That's what's going to ultimately happen over time. And that's a lot of extra dollars within an economic system that arguably doesn't have the physical resources and the human resources to actually cope with that amount of exchange value or buying power. And the risk as that unfolds is, of course, significant inflationary pressures adding on to the existing inflationary pressures in the United States economy.
We should. I want to bring up, the BRICS bridge. When you were describing the mBridge, the BRICS bridge, is that similar? Is that something different?
The underlying architecture and there's not a lot of information about this, to be honest, but I have no doubt that the learnings from a technical, operational, and governance point of view from the mBridge project has been part and parcel of the deliberations over the course of the last 12 months amongst the BRICS countries and the BRICS central banks. Interestingly, and this is probably something also worth remembering, is that in the BRICS environment, the BRICS themselves actually have their own bank. So whereas mBridge has as its major non-national banking participant being the Bank of International Settlements, in the BRICS environment, we have the New Development Bank. And we know that the New Development Bank has set itself a target of increasing the amount of investment and finance that it's making available to member countries and their enterprises in national currencies as well. So I think that there is, firstly, a concerted effort around enabling national currencies, obviously within a BRICS environment. Secondly, that the learnings from mBridge are being taken on board by the technical team as well as the policy teams that are working on the BRICS payment settlement that was agreed by the leaders of BRICS in South Africa last year. So I wouldn't be surprised if in fact there's quite a lot of similarities between how these infrastructures work.
That makes sense. Yeah. As far as technological independence, Warwick, how does China's push for technological independence from the West's markets and production capacity, especially in sectors like EVs and semiconductors, influence global markets and geopolitical dynamics?
Yeah, look, it's going to have a big impact. It's already having a big impact now. Over the course of the last 30 years, the dominant technology paradigm and the operational environment has been largely driven by US big tech. And in many ways, that has become normalized as the global standard. But of course, it's never been a global standard per se. It's an American standard that's been globalized. Now, that operating system, and I mean by that not just a technical one, but also an economic one, is based on the idea that the owners of that intellectual property are able to secure economic rents, which in layperson's terms is super profits. And you see that reflected in the market capitalization value of the big tech firms in America. So their ability to control, in effect, infrastructure, access to software, etc., confers upon them a power within a supply chain environment or a market environment that makes them really price setters as opposed to price takers. What's happened is that over the past 5 or 6 years, Chinese enterprises, together with Chinese government departments, driven in part by a desire to become even more technologically independent, but also in response to sanctions and that sort of stuff, the prohibitions on chip exports, has seen a big effort being made to develop both new operating systems, such as the Harmony OS environment from Huawei, as well as support the development globally of open source standards for hardware design, such as chip designs, as well as for software operating systems. And this transition to a global environment in which open source foundations enable technological systems to be built I call that essentially a form of digital Westphalia, whereby a common architecture lays the groundwork that enables nation states and enterprises and individuals and other organizations in those nation states to build technology solutions that bolster and which reflect ambitions around digital sovereignty, but at the same time enables these distinct national digital ecosystems to interoperate with each other on an as-needs basis. So there's some big transitions happening there fundamentally in terms of software and hardware operating environments. The other thing on that front is that part and parcel of the Americanization of global technology is the fact that much of the hardware is actually or has actually been owned and operated by large US firms in terms of the pipes that carry the data, whether it's submarine cables and wireless environments, fiber optic networks, and satellite infrastructure, that in many respects funnels data back into a set of data farms or data centers that are located in Virginia. Virginia is a pivotal node geographically in terms of the global information architecture, and because of its location, it has provided the basis upon which the American state has intervened in terms of making a copy of the data. Of course, it flows through that data center infrastructure, and also, of course, just to intervene and spy on what's going on. Now, that's progressively being unwound, and it's being unwound because there's alternative networks of undersea cables and alternative networks of satellite technologies, plus alternative networks of data centers being built across the world. So these are significant transformations in terms of technology that in many ways moves us beyond the rent-seeking model that has been characteristic of US big tech to an environment that is more supportive and conducive to digital Westphalia.
Yeah, I liked your article about that you recently wrote. I really like the open source direction, particularly. Go ahead, Anastasia.
Yeah, then we are hearing here a lot of information about new data centers, digitalization, but I'm still reflecting about that document that was released. So sorry if I'm not that plenum results report called Resolution on Further Deepening Reform to Advance Chinese Modernization.
Yeah.
Modernization. So China has set ambitious goal for modernization by 2035. So it means next 10 years. But what are the key elements of this plan? And
Yeah.
how might this impact on foreign investments and international trade in general?
Sure. Look, the plan is a holistic plan. It's not just an economic plan, it's a social plan, it's a cultural plan, it's an ecological plan, and it's a governance plan. And the distinctive feature of this particular approach and the way in which the integrated consensus is achieved through the Chinese governance processes that I described earlier is that it seeks to address the balances between these different dimensions and ensure that they are, as much as possible, harmoniously intertwined to become symbiotic and bolster each other. So there's no point having economic development if you've got social and cultural problems, for example. There's no point having economic development if you are leaving a legacy of pollution and poisoning the rivers and soil, etc., etc. So it's a very much an integrated approach. That's the first thing. The second thing, as we've just been talking about in detail, is that it's wrapped really by a focus on digitalization. So data or information sits at the heart of how you coordinate and harmonize these different elements. In terms of its relationship with the external world, that's largely going to take place um, in three main ways. Firstly, there's an ongoing emphasis of people-to-people exchange that will support collaborative research and development, as well as things like tourism experiences, wherever possible. The second part is in the trade of goods and services. So in terms of the trade of goods and services, China remains committed to an open global trading environment where it seeks to expand its trading relationships with countries around the world. Now, in doing that, it also recognizes that the flip side of trade per se is this idea of empowering its trading partners to move up the value ladder. And this is probably the most significant next piece or the next step change in this idea of Chinese globalization and Chinese modernization. And that is to drive the export of capital, money capital, fixed capital in terms of machinery and equipment, as well as soft capital in terms of know-how into other countries. So, for example, recently we've seen China invest in downstream processing in Egypt and in other parts of Africa. Now, traditionally, a colonial international economic model would see mines being developed in the peripheral economies and the natural resources sent back for processing in the center. China is now investing in processing capabilities in what were once the peripheral economies, and that will enable those economies to develop new skills and raise their living standards. The second thing it's doing is investing in factories, and so we're seeing that particularly in high-tech factories like EV. A lot of the stories you'll see, of course, is China progressively seeing its high labour cost content activities being relocated to other parts of the world, and that's happening as well. But I think some of the most interesting things is actually where the high-tech manufacturing of electric vehicles, etc., are being exported. The third thing that really makes this transition, if you will, to this next phase of Chinese modernization with a strong external orientation is through China's exports of energy technologies. And we're talking about renewable energy technologies in terms of generation capacity, whether it's improving efficiencies in solar capture, increasing the size and scale productivity of wind turbines, and developments in other kinds of renewable energy generation technologies. But I think the game changer is actually um, the dramatic reduction in costs in battery storage technologies, which enables intermittent power sources to become stabilized, consistent supply. And once you do that and you deploy this infrastructure into other parts of the world, those other parts of the world actually become, in effect, energy independent, just as China will progressively improve its own energy independence. And through energy independence, nations will be able to be far more um, uh, sovereign in terms of the ways that they approach the challenges and opportunities that they face. They will actually need to import far less energy, whether it's oil and gas. And of course, traditionally, to be able to pay for those things, you've had to earn US dollars. So that's going to be less likely the case going forward. But the ability to have an energy sovereign environment is a fundamentally transformative capability, particularly as the unit costs or the marginal cost of energy have been driven through the floor. That's the step change that I think this next 10 years of Chinese modernization is enabling, not just for itself, but for developing countries around the world.
Mm.
It's a huge
I,
plan.
mm, yeah, it's very interesting too. Because we have limited time, we're gonna sort of skip ahead a little bit, Warwick, because I think this is very important. We asked this question about ecological conservation and green development. Um, I'll note that in the results of the plenum, the term climate change was actually not referred to at all, which was very unusual, and it was described in a very different way, which I thought was actually excellent, because it distracts away from this issue of pollution, like you say about the rivers, the air. That's a major issue when we're looking at um, whether or not carbon dioxide is actually heating up the earth. That's something different, and I prefer not to get into that with you. But how does China's emphasis on ecological conservation and green development fit into its broader economic strategies, and what impact might this have on global environmental policies?
It will have a very significant impact. As I
Mm.
touched on, China has been, for the best part of 10 years, working quite hard on transforming the ways that its industries work and how industries impact on the ecological environment. Urbanisation has also been a big part of the China story, of course, over the last 20 years, and rapid urbanisation uh, clearly also generates a whole range of polluting activities. And for those of you who would have been to Beijing or any of the major Chinese cities, say 10 years
Mm.
or 12 years ago, would remember that the smoggy skies and the high PMI readings from the air pollution monitors. So something had to be done, and
Yes.
something has been done to dramatically reduce pollution without at the same time adversely affecting economic development. And so what's been undertaken is a transformation in the way that energy is produced for a lot of these activities, a progressive improvement in the efficiency of energy conversion itself, so that less energy is used for every given unit of final output, so that we reach a result which is actually a cleaner and more ecologically harmonious balance between human driven economic activity and the dynamics of the ecological system as a whole. Part of the integration that's referred to in the third Plenum communique really is about the harmonization of human existence on the planet as well as the planet's overall functioning. And this really draws on millennia of Chinese philosophy, which seeks to find the least conflictual and the smoothest pathway by which humans and nature can interact and evolve together. And you see that, of course, in the Taoist traditions, where many of the ways in which human existence and the ecology are thought through is through ideas of flows and blockages. And in many regards, you'll often see those analogies used to describe economic systems as well. So it's about reducing blockages, it's about harmonizing your flows so that you reduce friction, so that things move smoothly. And things move smoothly when the way that people go about doing their things is in sync with the way that nature needs to work as well.
Yeah, I love the. I know, go ahead.
Green finance, right? So if that's the sort of real economy focus, unsurprisingly, green finance is one of the fastest growing aspects of the finance sector. And China is now the world's largest issuer of green bonds, and that is likely to continue into the future, where a commitment to align finance with environmental or ecological KPIs in project and enterprise activities will be a key driver of investment and enterprise and business activities going forward.
Sorry, I had a bit of an issue with the connection there, but no, that's fine.
Yeah.
Look, we've gone over an hour, and you know, this sort of subject really deserves more. We haven't addressed any of the audience's questions yet. Warwick, would you come back on for us? And
I'd be happy to. Look, I'm happy to stay on for 10 minutes if you want, so that's okay.
No, it's okay. We actually try not to go too much over an hour. So,
No
but if you come on
problem.
another time,
yeah,
oh no, that'd be great. Thank you. So we'll end off unless Anastasia, you've got something you want to say?
Well, frankly speaking, I'm a person who is not too much in science, but in humanities, and I'm still impressed with that information about 73 seconds per electrical vehicle. So I propose our viewers.
That is impressive.
So I propose for our viewers to train their brains and to calculate how many electrical vehicles are produced in China during your coffee breaks daily.
Yeah.
There you go.
It is.
No,
So
it is. It's amazing, the capacity.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and I can see as well, you know, Warwick, how you've described about the efficiency. I assume you were talking about your project with the smart network as well. But that's a very large, when you're talking about a very large capacity, 18% efficiency improvement and a massive capacity. So that is very significant, especially if you're having to manage that and plan for that investment strategy. So
look, it goes to show how much finance capital is actually sitting idle in the cross-border trade and economic system generally in any given minute. We know people, for instance, who are in large-scale cross-border trade of food products, where on any given day they'll have $80 to $100 million worth of stock literally sitting in a warehouse because of the slowness in the movement of data, right? And its paperwork. So you can imagine what that's costing. $80 million a day times 365 times whatever percent they're paying for that working capital. is a very, very significant amount of cost that is imposed into these systems. And if you can reduce that and take it out, in fact, I would suggest that in some regards, what I call transactional efficiencies and use of money capital efficiencies are just as great in the overall economic system as you'll get in terms of your classic areas of productive efficiencies by having smarter technologies and automation, for example, in factories.
Mm.
See.
Okay. I'm breaking up a bit, so I apologize. But before we go, I want to show Warwick's book. So if you'd like to know more, please support Warwick and his work, because when you do, people like Warwick are encouraged to write more and publish more, and that's really good. And then they can come on the shows, they can talk to us more, right? They're free to do that. So I'm just showing that there. But we'll close off now. And
thanks, Clive. I must
thank you very much again, Warwick.
I must apologise for the price of the book. Unfortunately, academic publishing and the pricing is out of my hands. But
I thought it was a bit high.
But look, to me, I think unfortunately, I think it is. It's expensive in my view, and but I'm happy to be able to share some of the insights with you and your audience without burdening them with those costs. But look, if anybody is in a position, obviously, to buy the book, then I'd be much appreciated.
Well, we should always remember that.
Oh, I'm sure
knowledge is priceless.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
That's right. Exactly. Yes, and I'm sure someone like yourself, and especially what you've shown today, it would be worthwhile. And some people are quite productive and they can afford that easily. And our audience is very diverse. Actually, a lot of our audience is older, so they're above 40. So potentially, yeah. But yeah, let's finish off. Thank you, Warwick. Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you very much, Professor. We hope to see you next time.
Without a doubt.
Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Yeah, that's out there.
That the final move to put the logo was made by hand.
Yeah. They still do some QA manually with a real person, but they also have a humanoid robot that does some of the QA as well. So that Xiaomi factory is pretty awesome, quite amazing. But I'll tell you what, here's the interesting thing. These EV companies, they don't employ people very much on the shop floor anymore, of course, but their R&D departments and their engineering departments are huge. So they actually employ a lot of people, but no longer getting their hands dirty, dealing with heavy machinery, but literally sitting in air-conditioned offices working on design.
Well,
And
the factory looks futuristic.
yeah, well, no people, all clean. You know, the R&D departments are huge. And they're researching not just design, to make things look better and all of that, but they're constantly looking at process improvements. And they're working with their core technology providers around software, batteries, and all that sort of stuff. And it is quite it's an incredibly it's actually very labor intensive, but not in the way we would have thought of a car factory once. It's the labor intensive stuff's actually in the design and research.
Well, in fact, it's not like we used to think about how the car factory works. The guy with a screwdriver.
Yeah. Look, the battery factories are the same. So battery factories employ very, very few people on the ground these days. In the old days, battery factories employed a lot of people, and it was quite dangerous and toxic work.
Yeah, it is.
Factories, but the modern battery factories in China actually don't have many people on the shop floor at all. Again, all in R&D, all in chemical engineering, design engineering, that sort of stuff.
The programmers also, I think, they employ a lot because they should have invested a lot in AI.
Yeah, massive amounts. So you'll see in these factories. So all of these factories are now they're all 5G enabled. China has about 10,000 private corporate 5G networks deployed to support automation of production systems and growing. So the number of private 5G networks is expanding all the time, and that's all about enabling these things to happen. It's and these things will just be moved from country to country now. This is what's happening. They're just going to Africa, Southeast Asia, and they're doing turnkey implementations. Thailand, Malaysia. Crazy, huh?
Yeah, it is. It's excellent. This is a great prologue. I like this.
Yeah.
But we're going to end off.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. Good to see you all.
Now that China is will be a new enabler.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It is. So we see that.
That's all right. Thanks for tuning in to BRICS Briefs, everyone. If you've enjoyed this episode and wish to join the conversation, you can comment below. Please like and share this episode to spread it as far as possible. You are our sponsors. We're not paid by the Kremlin or the Chinese Communist Party. If you can donate, buy us a coffee, what do they call it, a super thanks, please do. You can follow us on our Substack and other social media platforms, especially our Telegram channel, all linked below. Stay curious, stay connected, stay optimistic. Let's keep exploring together. 再见。